as someone who is chosen, voted on by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's the Security Council's job to recommend someone to the General Assembly. This process has always been cloaked in secrecy and handled behind the scenes at the United Nations. But these ladies who are here with me from Pass Blue, an independent news source, not-for-profit news source, follow the situation behind the scenes at the UN closer than anyone. So we should have a lot to talk about here. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me. We have with us Dulcie Leimbach, who is the founder of Pass Blue, as well as Sonali Lassiter and Stephanie Fillon, who are contributors and have been reporting extensively on the election process this year, and attempts to open it up a bit more. So with that brief introduction, ladies, maybe Dulcie, we can start with you. The last election was in 2016. And we saw a real push to open things up, to make it a bit more open, a bit more democratic, at least so people knew who was running for the position and what they had to offer and where they stood. Can you talk about that? I believe there were 13 candidates, 7 of them women. Who was pushing that? What was it like last time? And how did that differ from elections in the past, just to set us up where we are going in 2021?
Yeah, thanks very much for arranging this. And just to clarify, Barbara Cassette is also a founder of Pass Blue. So I didn't start this on my own, and I don't do it all on my own. But the 2016 race, and some people don't even want to call it a race or an election. They say it was a selection process. So it's always, at the UN, it's always about semantics. But it was the motive of 1 for 7 billion sort of campaign, a coalition of NGOs, civil society, who worked with the president of the General Assembly at the time, a Dane, and to some extent, Samantha Power, who was the US ambassador, to open up this process, because it's always been closed. It's always been, Vatican style, smoke style. So they really worked hard on a campaign effort to open up the process. And it did become sort of revolutionary. And it was a very sort of hopeful process, and took place over a year, the 2016 for the 2017 selection. And ultimately it had public dialogues where the candidates, 13 of them eventually, went before the General Assembly and really had to present their platform and field questions. And it was really sort of mind-boggling to see the UN be so open in this process. And there were 7 women and 6 men, and from all over the world, New Zealand to Eastern Europe to Latin America to Western Europe. So it was sort of revelatory to see the UN rally behind this process, and the candidates speak openly and talk to the media. And this went on for a year. And then there were straw polls along the way held by the Security Council, voting on the candidates and sort of designating by number how many votes they got. So that process was sort of a winnowing down, and eventually 2 or 3 candidates dropped out. But none of the women ever actually got to number 1 in the straw polls. So that was a big signal that there was not going to be a woman Secretary General, despite the enormous efforts by civil society groups and groups like trying to garner support for women Secretary General. So this year, so ultimately it boiled down to the Security Council, once again in the P5, once again in probably just the P3, US, Russia, and China, deciding on who they would recommend to the General Assembly to ultimately vote. And that was by October that year, 2016. And they came out from their last straw poll. The Security Council members and Samantha Power announced that the candidate was António Guterres of Portugal, the former UN refugees chief for 10 years and a former prime minister. So, yeah.
Just to be clear, were all of those candidates nominated by member states?
Yes, they were all nominated by their individual countries. And there were 2 nominations from Bulgaria. And it was supposed to be Eastern Europe's turn, in this sort of geographic informal rotation. So it was supposed to be a candidate from Eastern Europe to get the job. And so that was a big blow for Eastern Europe to lose that opportunity to Western Europe. Yeah. I think there was obviously a lot of disappointment among a lot of people. So this year it's a whole different animal because everyone is saying it's because 1, the pandemic got in the way of the sort of lead up, and 2, the Secretary General is running again. So the incumbent. There's an incumbent where there wasn't, in 2016. So that's presenting some challenges and barriers to making this sort of a democratic, open process, and not allowing other candidates nominated by their countries to step forth because they don't want to offend the Secretary General.
Right. Well, Stephanie, you were telling me about that a little bit. I know you've been looking at this process, and do you think why do you think the member states are stepping back this time and not so eagerly appointing someone? Is it traditional for a Secretary General to get 2 terms? I mean, it's not a guarantee, right?
So it is not a guarantee, but I think it's been what's been happening traditionally. And I think that Sona can really talk about that better than I do. Yeah. But I think in terms of, yes.
That question. So I'm sorry, I confused my S. So I didn't mean to ask her that. If you want to hand it off to her.
Go ahead, Sona.
Sona, yeah, no, because I know you've really been engaged on this and talking to a lot of people.
Yeah, so the history of precedent is a pretty strong barrier in this environment of the selection process this year. With the exception of just 2, every Secretary General in history has served for 2 5-year terms. And that creates a disincentive this year where the expectation for a lot of people because of the precedent is that to raise your name, raise your hand as a contender is challenging not only a precedent, but also saying something which might not be politically or strategically the most advantageous for a candidate in this election cycle.
And so am I right, the only people that have come forward to challenge Guterres at this point are self-appointed candidates? Do you know how many there are and where they're coming from?
We think there might be 6 names so far. It's unclear if there are more. Dulcie was just saying before we started the panel that there might be 2 more names that have been offered, but there seems to be this separate list of candidates who are self-nominated who are not named, and then candidates who are official, or 1 candidate who is our official and only candidate, António Guterres, our incumbent. So the question now is really around what are the written rules, which when you look at the UN Charter, which is just 1 sentence, or any of the UN resolutions that have to do with the selection process, there's nothing written in any of those documents that are official that say you need member state backing or any country's backing to be an official candidate. So it's putting the UN in a very limbo space. They can't say yes, they can't say no to these civil society self-nominated candidates at this point. And it might be due to the pandemic, which shut down all of New York as of last spring in 2020. That's when these meetings were supposed to happen for the UN to hash out, okay, how are we going to handle having an incumbent next year in the selection process, which is still a very new thing for us. and they weren't able to nail that down by September of last year. So there's still an opportunity now to address it. And the 1 for 7 billion campaign that Dulcie addressed earlier, they have just recently put out a discussion paper that asks for clarification from the UN system, asking if you need to actually have member state backing, if you need any countries backing, your own country or a different one. And also they offer some selection criteria, more than what we have already for eligibility for a Secretary General. So
interesting, but we're really in uncharted territory here. Nobody knows quite how to deal with this. The president of the General Assembly has a website for candidates, but so far we only see the one official one there. I guess that's because they don't know how to characterize these, or whether or not they even have to be considered, I guess. Stephanie, you broke the story about a young woman who's from Canada, a Canadian citizen, Arora Akanksha, who has declared herself a candidate very boldly, stepping out and deciding that she is going to run for Secretary General. How did you come across her, and what were her motivations?
Yeah, that was indeed very bold as a decision. So what happened is that, a person working for the UN forwarded me her first campaign video and her candidacy, basically. So I looked at the video, which was sort of interesting. I wouldn't say it was it was clearly not a 100% professional video, but she was still making interesting points in it. So I thought it was worth talking to her. Initially, I sent it to Dulcie and we talked about it. And initially what we wanted to do was just to sort of maybe write a small paragraph about, this UN employee wanted to run for Secretary General. But when we first saw it, I think we were very skeptical, because it's kind of like, hey, I can be, I'm going to run too as Secretary General. Anybody could basically say that. But the fact that she was a UN employee was sort of interesting to me. So I gave her a call and I realized that she actually has a lot to say. And she's not only there to criticize, but she also, I think she really wants a debate. She wants to, hold António Guterres accountable. And she really believes that she has a chance as Secretary General. So I interviewed her and I thought that she was interesting enough. But of course, the angle of the article wasn't really like, here's this new Secretary General candidate. It was more about the significance of this UN employee and also what it means for the process in general. Because early on in the campaign, as you said, we asked Bianan Varma, the spokesperson for the president of the General Assembly, if it was a requirement, and it wasn't a clear no at the time. They were open to it. But I think after Arora Akanksha stepped forward, they sort of backtracked and they said, no, it's a requirement to be backed by member states. So, just having those kind of people like that, it really does challenge the system and it forced people to really give answers about that. So when, after I talked to her, we decided to write the article and then found out that maybe some reporters were going to be interested in it. So decided to publish the story, which ended up, I think, being the right decision that Dulcie made, because it ended up being, I think, a tremendously popular story. And it also, I think, maybe pushed other media to talk to her, to have sort of this broader discussion about what she's doing. And, in general, it was interesting to sort of have also a millennial, she's only 34-year-old, and a woman as a candidate. So that's she can bring something different, I guess, to the table, and maybe looking at it through the lens that she can bring a new perspective to the conversation, rather than, she can be elected as the next Secretary General, is something that, can make this race at least interesting.
It is interesting, and it's interesting that the people who are coming forward are people, or the ones that we know of so far, are coming from within the UN system. So obviously have some knowledge of what's happening there, but also wanted to work there for some reason, and now want to make change. I know, Dulcie, we were talking, Emma Riley is another woman, a known UN whistleblower who's now come out on Twitter and declared herself a candidate as well. What does it say to you that these people are coming from inside the UN to make the case for the job?
Yeah, it's sort of amazing that they're even coming forth, because I think it does take a lot of courage to come out there. And if they're, especially if they work for the UN and they say publicly, there's some serious problems here. I actually think there are a total of 6 sort of civil society applicants now. And I think, a lot of experts are saying there is a GA resolution setting out the guidelines and sort of reinforcing that these candidates, all candidates, need to have national endorsements. And Stephanie has followed Aurora's candidacy, even writing also about her conversation with Canada to endorse her. And I think that's still undecided. So we know probably 4 of these candidates. And Emma Riley is a whistleblower, for want of a better word. I think maybe she may identify herself as that, who works in Geneva for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Right.
And so she's a candidate who says she has accused the UN office there of providing names of Chinese activists and dissidents to China, people who are not in China, regarding the Uyghur situation. So that's one of her main platforms. And there's
pretty serious accusations.
Pretty serious, yeah.
Whereas Aurora,
UN denies it. So,
right.
That's the situation. Aurora also has complaints. But overall, I think that the main issue here is that these people who work for the UN or even have worked for the UN or, in that circle are saying there's some serious problems here that aren't being addressed, and that António Guterres needs some challengers. He shouldn't be able to just sort of breeze through this process without any challengers. And why is the UN General Assembly President's Office, which is sort of by default handling this process, because apparently Security Council presidencies are sort of kicking the can down the road, but why are they not releasing these applicants' names?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Stephanie, I know you've also talked to, the Canada situation, that kind of puts them on the spot, right? They would have, if they backed her, then she would have to be taken much more seriously, but then they would be seen as backing someone against Guterres, who's more likely to get in. Am I right? That puts them in a pretty awkward spot.
It is a pretty awkward spot for Canada. And full disclosure, I'm Canadian, so I really look at this as, with my Canadian eyes. And I really see sort of, for Canada, I guess there could be positive and negative consequences to support her. I guess on the positive side, Canada is led by a very progressive leader and has a very progressive government right now. So it could just send a message that, and Canada has a feminist foreign policy too. So it could just send a message, hey, we want to support a woman Secretary General, and we also want to support a young person as Secretary General. Canada has also lost a race for a seat on the Security Council recently. So I think it could, sort of show Canada's a bigger engagement for Canada with the UN. So, at least Canada could be more in the spotlight at the UN, and that could be something good for the country. So I think that could be something else that is positive for Canada, although Canada has been pretty involved during the pandemic with, other issues. On the negative side, I think, so first of all, there's yes, she's Canadian. Yes, she is a candidate, but she is not a public persona in Canada. And until, 2 months ago, until she had a profile, in the New York Times, she wasn't known at all in the country. And when you think about it, there are so many qualified women in Canada that they could push forward as a candidate, some on top of my head, many of them I can think of on top of my head. So I think that if Canada decided to push her candidacy, then some people in the country could be like, wait, maybe she's not the most qualified candidate to do that, not just because she's decided that she wants to be a candidate. And I think on the other negative side, as you said, of course, it would also show that Canada doesn't really support António Guterres, so it could be seen as a confrontation against the Secretary General.
Yeah. And we should point out, too, that Sustainable Development Goal 5 states that the need to achieve gender equality and empower all women, girls is crucial. And it sets the goal of 2030. So hence the question of why not a woman? Why have we not seen a woman? Why aren't we seeing more women candidates? And Stephanie, you also talked to this other group, the Forward campaign, I guess #Forward they're using, kind of late to the race, but ambitious goals of opening up the, as Dulcie correctly noted, the selection process, election, not the right term, but how are they planning to do that? I think they talked about having I have it in my notes here. What did they call a
global digital primaries?
What is that? What is that?
So they are young European political organizers. There's two of them, one man from Italy, Andrea Benzon, and a woman from France, her name is Colombe. And so they have been involved in politics. They've ran campaign, human rights campaign, but also they elected one person to the European Parliament in the last elections. So they're sort of experienced political organizer. And I guess they decided that lately they were like, oh, there's a Secretary General election and not that many people care about it. So they decided to sort of create this initiative to, in a way, make it more interesting and at least sort of also start this discussion about the Secretary General. And so what they're going to do is now they're recruiting volunteers. They told me they've already recruited 10 people to help them. They're going to soon start to find candidates until the end of April. And then they're going to ask people to vote for the candidates that they've picked. And I think there's two things that really strikes me as important here. The first one really shows that, we're not 75 years ago when we created the UN. We live in a world that's extremely interconnected, and we live in a world where reaching people all over the world is getting easier and easier. And the message they're sending is that, we the people, that's the mantra of the organization. So maybe the people could be more involved in getting to choose a Secretary General. I mean, the person that really represents them at the UN. So I think they're really trying to sort of bring new technologies to this election process, saying, we need to update this process. And the other thing that they're doing that could help, one main issue that we have here is, no member state really want to upset Guterres. I think that if they find a candidate that is globally supported, if the country of origin of this person say, they just were elected globally, I think it may look less as a confrontation to Guterres if it comes through this campaign than if the member state just decide to nominate this person. And, their goal is really so they only take women's application. They really want to find a woman. And they're also leaning on the progressive side. But their main goal is to find really qualified, credible candidates. So, we've been talking about this sort of issue that people are all self-nominated and they don't necessarily have the experience that is required to run for this role. So this campaign could actually, if it's successful, find a candidate that could be credible against António Guterres. That being said, as you said, late April is late. to start sort of asking people to vote. And I think such an initiative could have been successful if they started maybe a year ago or earlier than that to really build momentum. Because if you're trying to reach a lot of people around, you really want a global campaign, then it takes a while for people to hear about it. But they've gotten some coverage, I think, in Japan and Italy. So people are starting to talk about it, and hopefully people are going to care.
It's interesting, so pressure from inside and outside of the institution on this. People are questioning, why are we still doing things this way? The Center for Research on Women graded Guterres on gender issues, and last year gave him a B. We know he's put out his statement, if you will. Actually, we got some questions, and I would encourage anybody who's watching, if they have any questions that they'd like our panelists to answer, to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. But ahead of time, somebody did ask the question. They were interested in our panelists' feedback on Guterres's statement. There was a question from an Andrea Warden on that, what his statement and the impact on other candidates. I'm thinking in particular where he stands on women's issues. Sona, maybe you would have a little more background on that in terms of your reaction to his statement and his stance on women's and gender issues, how he's done as Secretary General.
Well, I just recently went through the 2021 vision statement, which is most recently released, and did a little comparison with his first vision statement from 2016. The 2016 vision statement is about 5 pages long, minus the intro letter. And this year, his vision statement is about 15 pages when you take out the intro letter. So it's definitely much more comprehensive. It builds a lot on what he already stated in 2016. And he does, in light of the grade B survey study that was done, specifically talking about women, I did see that he notes wanting to increase the number of women peacekeepers, which is a great thing. But I was really looking for some key words around women in peace building, preventing abuse and exploitation by UN peacekeepers, that keyword abuse. I was searching for the word whistleblower, and there isn't any acknowledgement written in the vision statement for this year, specifically talking about preventing abuse or implementing any new whistleblower protections within the UN system. So those are still areas that are unacknowledged, but there's still opportunity with his May discussions coming up that he could still talk about them or be asked about them. But yeah, the point about more women peacekeepers being included and more women to be integrated into peace building has been mentioned. So I think that's 2 big points that have been in that grade B study that I did see in his vision statement.
And Dulcie, that's where women have typically, lagged at the UN, right? In peacekeeping and certainly in top executive roles as well, but there's been progress on that front. But peacekeeping is kind of the one area where women are still not up to par, correct?
Yeah, and that takes a long time. I mean, the primary barrier is that the troop contributing countries don't have a lot of women in their ranks. So that's a major challenge. Also, Sona mentioned something important, which is they are planning to have a dialogue with Guterres, and I think it's the president of the General Assembly, Bozkir, on May 7th. So this is part of the sort of open, transparent process. And I think Sona raised some important issues that the 16-page vision statement is sort of devoid of specifics, including specific problems within the UN. It's very heavily focused on what the Secretary General can do with member states, which is, makes total sense because it is a member state organization. But it just sort of, and he has gotten gender parity in the top levels of the UN. The middle levels are still pretty weak, and then the lower levels, frankly, I don't know, but it doesn't mean that the culture has changed in the UN, in the workplace. And so there are like structural problems. It's not really enough to say, okay, now we have 7 women who are this and 7 men, or we have 8 women and 7 men. The problems don't go away like so simply. But so, the vision statement is grand and ambitious, but I would have liked to have seen really more specific things that he's planning to do as a leader of the UN. So, Stephanie, did you take a look at this, or?
No, I didn't have time to read the whole vision statement yet.
Yeah, but Stephanie has been following the campaign of Arora, who also has a sort of gender equality issues. And then Sona, in her long story for us about whether there will be a female Secretary General candidate, sort of talked to people who suggested that candidates should step forth anyway for X number of reasons. Yeah. And one of them was just to get a woman's name out there. So it's still, it's still an open race, and maybe something could happen especially with the Forward campaign. I think that has some potential.
It's interesting. A really interesting question from one of our viewers. Frank Gomez asked, what are the chances of the US supporting a woman candidate? And given Samantha Power was so instrumental in opening things up last time around, are we seeing any engagement from the US on this front?
Yeah, well, I'll let Stephanie or Sona talk about that.
Well, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield was asked that very specific question in her briefing with the press at the beginning of her presidency. And she said that the question was loaded. So that was her answer. So I think it was a difficult question to answer, of course, because, you don't have any names of women candidates other than Arora Akanksha for now. And I feel like the focus of the United States right now, it's a new administration. So I feel like, the focus is really to sort of rebuild relationships with allies. So my impression, and I would love to hear Sona and Dulcie about it, my impression is just that, they're okay with António Guterres, they're happy with him. So, that's sort of it's not a priority for now. That would be my impression.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So, and then Sona, Samantha Power was very instrumental in opening things up last time. I mean, let's face it, right? Unless the Security Council, unless some powerful members push things, sometimes things don't get done at the UN. But would this be in they'd have to see this in their interest, I guess.
Yeah, I would be pretty shocked to see the United States openly support a candidate at this point, because I don't think it's top of their agenda. Like Stephanie was saying, they've got a lot of other things going on at the moment. So yeah, UN activities isn't the top of their agenda, but they seem to remain neutral from what the ambassador's answer sounded like. And in terms of providing their own candidate, that would be a complete shock. And I don't think that's something we should expect from them this year. It would be a really controversial thing for any of the permanent members of the Security Council, I think, to introduce their own candidate this year, because they are such a powerful group within the Security Council. So that's probably something not to be expected.
Yeah, I think Dulcie, traditionally they nominate outside the at least for appearances, that they're spreading the power around.
Right. For appearances. Yeah, and Secretary of State Blinken was visited the UN on Monday virtually, and he said something along the lines of to Guterres, you have a very impossible job. Congratulations for getting through it, the 4 years or 4.5 years. Some people read that as an endorsement, however subtle or unsubtle. But yeah, I think the P5 are okay with the status quo.
Well, they're not known for picking candidates that are going to challenge them, right? At least not in recent history. But it's a tough job. They have to, well, I guess that's why they're called diplomats. Stephanie, Angela Merkel was floated as a name, the German chancellor, of a potential woman candidate for Secretary General. Was that ever real, or was that just wishful thinking on the part of people who wanted to see a woman and thought she had the best chance?
So her name was floated in 2016. It started then, and I guess what changed since then is that she's going to retire as chancellor in 2020. So it was worth this year to wonder, would she be interested to become the next UN Secretary General? Because who is more qualified than Angela Merkel to hold this very difficult job? But so I wrote a story about it. I did some digging, both in terms of her career, her interests, and talking to diplomats and experts. And I think the clear answer I got was from her own spokesperson and also the German mission, which was no, she is not interested to get this job. And, a lot of people just say, she doesn't really want to be involved in politics in general anymore. She was a scientist before being a politician. So a lot of people see her being actually more involved in science than in politics after she retires. But one interesting thing that one expert told me was this sort of word, some Machiavelli that she's known for, sort of a parallel for Machiavelli. So she thinks in advance and she's very planned. So who knows, maybe she could make a move in 5 years. Maybe she could eventually be interested. But for now, Germany has reiterated their support for Guterres. So she does not seem to be really interested to be running this year.
Yes. A question from one of our viewers that I don't know if we can answer, but I'll throw it out there. Someone's asking about the position of WFUNA and UNA USA on the SG selection process. It's very specific. I don't know if anybody knows that, but I'll throw it out there. And also, in terms of the meetings that never happened this year about the process and things are, now that it's coming out and now that we're getting all these self-declared candidates, is there any inkling that they're getting together to deal with that, or does it all come down to the PGA president now?
Maybe Sona can answer that, because she did a lot of background research and talked to the 1 per 7 billion people.
Yeah, do you know that, Sona?
Could you ask that again? Sorry, the heater's turning on and I couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, given there was this big push to open things up, and then this year, because of COVID or because of the incumbency of Guterres, it didn't happen. But now that we have all these candidates coming out of the woodwork, you said that there was some discussion about how to deal with it, but do we see any meetings actually happening? Is anyone coming together, or is it all down to the PGA president at this time, or to do something? Is it all being done behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, and is in the hands of the PGA president and the Security Council president, who work together in the selection process to probably initiate a meeting if they're going to issue any more details and clarification on what procedures they're following, what rules they're clearly going to put out in place. So that a lot of that has been being pushed from that 147 billion campaign. So the latest in terms of a push for more clarification to happen, I've seen coming from them in their campaign. But I don't know of any actual meetings that are going to be taking place. I haven't heard anything new about action.
Yeah, another viewer writes that Human Rights Watch has come out in favor of female candidates. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with no female candidates at the conclusion of the last CSW, the Conference on the Status of Women. Did you guys cover that? I mean, what was your feeling this year? We had Kamala Harris, US Vice President, first female US Vice President, first US Vice President of color. To me, it didn't seem like a real exciting event, but it was also, everything's virtual, so it's hard to compare with one's past. Did you guys get any sense from the people that you spoke to at the UN, whether people were excited about women's issues or felt they were getting the back seat, or what was your sense of the event?
Well, Stephanie just wrote a piece for FES, the German think tank. So, you know.
So Stephanie, you're perfect to answer that question.
Yeah, so I think what really stood out this year for CSW was the United States re-engagement. And of course, as you said, the fact that Kamala Harris sent a pre-recorded video message, you know, that was very symbolic in terms of CSW. And, you know, in terms of Human Rights Watch supporting, you know, female candidates, you know, there are a lot of civil society organizations that do. And I think nobody denied that there's a desire globally to see a female secretary general, I think. And one of the questions that I saw is, you know, what about 2026? And ultimately, that's probably, you know, what we're going to see happen. The only thing is that realistically, 2026 is probably what's going to happen if a woman gets elected. But the problem is that it's going to be 81 years of the UN without a female secretary general back then. But, you know, it's 5 more years. So
in the big scheme of things, it's 5 more years, right?
But yeah, actually it's 5.5. Just on a note, I mean, somebody, a diplomat from South America who I'm friendly with, she did send me a text message this morning and a list of 6 possible women candidates from the region who are sort of waiting to jump in. And she didn't say jump in this year or jump in 5 years from now. And, you know, all highly qualified women, some ex-foreign ministers. So, yeah, as Stephanie said, it's shaping up to be a race that will actually happen in 2026. Is that the right year? So, yeah. As this diplomat said, women will have to wait, which to me, I find, you know, deeply frustrating as a woman. Why do we always have to wait?
Good question. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting because perhaps none of these candidates have the gravitas or the experience to be taken seriously, but you do get the sense that this conversation makes the United Nations uncomfortable and officials uncomfortable. I mean, it really does kind of expose a bit of hypocrisy here. If, you know, we're the institution about human rights, we're about, you know, democracy and representation and gender equality, and we have none of that, it would seem, in this process. Have you, in your reporting, maybe Sona or Stephanie, encountered the brush off a little bit when you talk to UN officials here? Or, I mean, do you feel like they're taking this seriously or just trying to hide, or what kind of reaction do you get when you ask questions?
So talking to people inside the UN, I think, you know, you want to have an open race, but there's also, on the other hand, there's a risk that if you let anybody run, that it's going to make the process look, it could delegitimize the process in a little bit. So I think it's important to sort of filter what candidates you let in the race, but there is definitely some frustration in terms of the transparency around the process. Why not disclose the names? So there's this aspect, but also when I talk to people around the UN, there's a lot of enthusiasm around the candidacy of Arora Akanksha. But there's also some people, saying, especially diplomat, that you want to have the right women running for the job. So you really want to have the candidates that are, you want candidates that are qualified, because otherwise it's going to be sort of a distraction. That's what I've heard from some diplomats as well.
Dulcie, you're a veteran UN reporter, and at the risk of asking you to divulge your secrets, it's really a tough place to cover. How would you even begin to talk about Secretary General candidates when it's such a secretive process? Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to cover this as a reporter, since we are an organization for journalists here?
Piggybacking on what Stephanie said, one of the candidates, her name is Fatima Nulinum. She announced herself publicly this week, and she says she's a Turkish citizen. So I think Stephanie actually asked the Turkish delegation whether they were backing her. It's people want to talk about this topic because it is so important, but nobody, of course, wants to go on record, and so that's a constant frustration. Sometimes it's understandable, sometimes it's not. So, Stephanie and Sona have done an incredible job of tracking this story from different angles. And, I think it's just got to be completely covered as much as possible, even if the candidates that are self-nominating are, don't have a ghost chance, because they do sort of end up reflecting what the overall problems are and the overall issues and the frustrations. And so, I encourage Sona and Stephanie and other reporters to just keep your ears tuned, because this matters. It really does matter. And for an organization that says it's, into gender parity, this is a huge gap in terms of what its reputation and what it wants to project. If it doesn't have if it's never had a woman leader qualified. And then I'm not just talking about a quota, meeting a quota. I'm talking, there are tons of qualified women out there to take this job. So what's the problem?
And maybe just to follow up on, what you've mentioned about, journalists, I'd like also to mention that a lot of journalists in the UN press corps, I've been impressed. They've done a tremendous job at keeping the President of the General Assembly spokesperson accountable. I mean, we've seen questions being asked, not every single day, but very often at the press briefings. And even though we don't get answers, people keep asking. So there is a great work going on right now in terms of looking for accountability on this side that hopefully is going to bear fruit eventually. Hopefully this year.
No, I mean, and the spokesperson is, it seems like he's just as frustrated as the rest of us. So, it's sort of leads back up the ladder. What's happening, and why is there sort of no public accounting about this process? Here we are, 2021. I mean, you can blame the pandemic on a lot of things, but it's a constant frustration to get information, and including on this topic. And the journalists are asking Brendan Varma, the spokesperson, questions regularly, and his hands are tied, it sounds like. I think at one point he even said this week, good question. I'd like to know myself, something like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm looking for, and you mentioned Fatima. She wrote in with a bunch of questions for us ahead of time. But I think there are more questions for the Secretary General himself. Why has he been quiet about sexual exploitation and abuse? Why has he not taken up certain issues, which of course we can't answer, but it does get back to the point that a lot of these women, at least who are throwing their names in the ring, seem to have internal UN reform issues on their mind. Does that undermine their credibility though, Stephanie, do you think? That, I mean, not that, that it's not a legitimate issue, that there, or maybe it strengthens their credibility because, we're saying this organization is not running well on the inside. How can it do things well for the rest of the world? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's always sort of easy to run a campaign based on complaints that you have. I think the biggest challenge running an election campaign is to come up with solutions, and especially when you get in the role to really implement them. And I have a lot of respect for António Guterres in that regards, because he's been a gender advocate, and he has tried to solve problems, but he's facing problems that other Secretary General didn't have to face, and those were 5 very difficult years. And just to echo what one diplomat told me, whatever Secretary General that had to deal with the Trump administration and sort of made it through deserved a second term. You had a very tense relationship with the U.S. You had a pandemic, lots of conflicts that are not getting better around the globe. So it's really a tough job. But these women do sort of echo, and looking back at Arora Akanksha, she says she's gotten a lot of emails from her colleagues sort of supporting her, and she was involved in issues such as reforms, and that's where her frustration came from, because I guess she got this feeling that she was there to reform the organization, but in the end she wasn't able to really accomplish anything. So she that's really what she is complaining about. But again, it's important to highlight these problems, but to solve them, it's much more complicated, because of course the Secretary General already has so much diplomacy to work around in his role.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say that Sona's piece sort of delves into the reasons why a woman should throw her hat in the ring, regardless of her chances of success. And there were really specific reasons. So, maybe Sona should lay out those arguments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are you hearing from the women's organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question.
One obvious reason is that it brings visibility to a woman to gain platform now. Everyone's going to look for the next person who's going to throw their name into the ring. And so it's symbolic in itself. Another reason for a woman to throw their name in now is to maybe be a little strategic, playing the long game, and getting some recognition now, even if she knows that her chances are pretty low that she'll beat an incumbent. So that's something that Ben Donaldson, who I spoke to, who's one of the co-founders for One for 7 Billion, had mentioned, which is in the bottom part of my article. Some of the candidates, female or male, who had participated in the selection process in 2016, maybe went into it knowing their chances aren't high, but it was a politically strategic move, because even after it was over, they've gone on to posts somewhere else internationally that have been like another leg up. So it is a powerful thing just to have publicity any publicity is good publicity. And for 193 member states to know your name and know who you are. It's good for launching again the next time if you're going to run.
Yeah.
And actually, there was a woman's name tossed out in the conversation you had with some feminists, right, Sona? An African woman?
Yes. Lema Bowie, I think is
Yeah.
her last name. She's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate from Liberia. I had seen her speak at a teaching conference of the UN right before the pandemic shut everything down last year. She spoke next to Gloria Steinem about women and how they're involved with peace and war, just generally in the world. So she offered a lot of her personal experience with that, leading the women's peace movement in Liberia during their war.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly has, again, called attention to the issue, to the lack of openness at the organization. And as you have all said, it's a very brave move for a lot of these people who are actually working at the UN to take on their bosses. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, they're just doing it for personal gain, or they're doing it, just to get their name out there or something, but it's not an easy thing to do when you work within the organization, is it? But clearly people feel motivated to come out and do it. So it seems like it's time. It seems like the women are lining up, and if it's not going to be this year, boy, the next time around, it's going to be there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of complaints, I think. So maybe they're putting the United Nations on notice, and we're putting the United Nations on notice, I guess, that all us women are watching. And
the question is,
what's happening. And
is the UN listening? That's the question.
Right. Well, ladies, thank you so much for explaining what's happening, how it happens, and all the work that you do behind the scenes at the United Nations to hold these officials accountable when they aren't elected, technically, but they do have an impact on so many people all around the world. And thanks to all of our viewers who tuned in. I hope everyone learned something, and we'll check back in on one of our other panels. We have them every week. So with that, I'm going to close things down, I guess. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening.